Frankly, having spent a few years in Washington, I would say that any notion of a takeover of the political apparatus in D.C. is fantasy. And even if a political sea change were to occur, the army of 4.3 million federal employees is not simply going to disappear overnight. So convincing libertarians to adopt a libertarian political system, if such an oxymoron could even exist, is a hopeless endeavor, at least in our current culture. And I'm sure we all understand that politics is a trailing indicator, right? Culture leads, politics follows. There can't be a political sea change in America unless and until there's a philosophical, an educational, and a cultural sea change. And over the past 100 years, progressives, and I use that term euphemistically as it's used commonly today, progressives have overtaken education, media, fine arts, literature, pop culture, and thus, as a result, they've overtaken politics, not the other way around. So this is why our movement, the libertarian movement, must be a battle for hearts and minds. It must be an intellectual revolution, because right now, bad ideas run the world. We can't expect a libertarian political miracle to happen in an illibertarian society. Don't get me wrong. I think the libertarian movement's growing. I think our philosophy is winning. I think we are winning hearts and minds. This is a time for boldness, not pessimism. But I question whether libertarianism will ever be a mass, which is to say majority political movement. I mean, some people will always support the state. And we shouldn't kid ourselves about this. It really doesn't matter why. Is it genetic? Is it something in our DNA that makes us inclined to be libertarians or statists? Is it environmental factors? Is it family influence? Is it bad schools? Is it media influences? Or is it simply some innate human desire to seek security, the false security blanket of the state? Maybe we'll never know. But we make a fatal mistake when we water down our message, when we dilute it, to seek approval from people who seemingly are hardwired to oppose us and our arguments no matter what. And we waste precious time and energy. What's important is not convincing those who fundamentally disagree with us. What's important is the degree to which we can extract ourselves from their political control. And this is why secession is a tactically superior approach in my view. It is far less daunting to convince liberty-minded people to walk away from the state than to convince those with a statist mindset to change. Now, I have to come back to Hoppe. And he raises a question that some of you are thinking in your minds again, is what about the federales? Wouldn't the federales simply crush any such attempt at localized secession, Hoppe asks. Well, I'll quote him a little more. He says, well, he says this with a German accent. He says, they surely would like to, but whether or not they can actually do so is an entirely different question. It is only necessary to recognize that the members of the governmental apparatus always represent, even under conditions of democracy, a very small proportion of the total population. So Hoppe envisions a growing number of what he calls implicitly seceded territories, engaging in non-compliance with federal authority. He continues, without local enforcement by compliant local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air. It would be prudent, he continues, to avoid a direct confrontation with the central government and not openly denounce its authority. I think we can all agree with that. Rather, it seems advisable to engage in a policy of passive resistance and non-cooperation. One simply stops to help in the enforcement in each and every federal law. Now, some of our conservative friends like to talk a good game when it came to Obamacare on that very notion. And finally, Hoppe concludes, now you have to bear with him here, that he was speaking in the mid-1990s for context. Waco, a tiny group of freaks, is one thing. But to occupy or to wipe out a significantly large group of normal, accomplished, upstanding citizens is quite another and quite a more difficult thing. Now, you may disagree with Dr. Hoppe as to the degree to which the federal government would actively order military violence to tamp down any secessionist hotspots, but his larger point is unassailable. The regime is largely an illusion, and consent to its authority is largely based on fear, not respect. Eliminate the illusion of benevolence and omnipotence, and consent quickly crumbles. So imagine what a committed cadre of coordinated libertarians could achieve in America. 10% of the US population, or roughly 32 million people, would be an unstoppable force of nonviolent withdrawal from the federal Leviathan. And as Hoppe posited, it's no easy matter for the state to arrest or attack large groups of citizens. And as American history teaches, our own history, the majority of people in any conflict are likely to be fence sitters rather than antagonists. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about our friends on the left and right. And one of the great ironies of our time is that both the political left and right complain bitterly about the other, but steadfastly refuse to consider, once again, the obvious solution staring us in the face. Now, the left, God love them, one might think that progressives would champion states' rights and the 10th Amendment because it would liberate them from the Neanderthal right-wingers who stand in the way of their progressive utopia. Imagine California or Massachusetts having every progressive policy firmly in place without any preemptive federal legislation to worry about, without having to worry about federal courts, and without having to share federal tax revenues with the hated red states. Imagine the 11 counties that make up the San Francisco Bay Area voting for whatever they wanted in their own little world. These are counties that routinely, overwhelmingly send Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi to the US Senate. These are counties that overwhelmingly voted for Barack Obama. What would be so wrong with them having things the way they want? But if you ask a progressive, what would be so wrong with the Salt Lake City Provo area in Utah having things the way it wants? Then all of a sudden progressives aren't so progressive. They strongly oppose federalism and states' rights, much less secession. And the reason, of course, is that progressives think they're winning. They don't intend for a minute to let any of us just walk away from what they've got planned for us. So democracy is the great political shibboleth, the great orthodoxy of our time, and its supposed champions on the left can't abide true localized democracy, which is all secession really is. They're interested in democracy when the vote goes their way, and then only at the most attenuated federal level, or if they could have it their way at the international level. The last thing they want is local control over anything. They're the great centralizers and consolidators of state power, and live and let live is just not in their DNA. All you need to know about progressives is this. In Ron Paul's America, vast areas, whole cities, whole regions could collectively get together on a voluntary basis and have Obamacare or single-payer health care or any system they might want for their health care. And nobody in a Ron Paul administration would bother them one whit. But in Barack Obama's America, nobody in Utah can walk away from Obamacare. So it's a one-way street. Now, I'd like to say that I have better news to report about our conservative friends, but I don't. Our friends on the right are scarcely better. Many conservatives are still hopelessly wedded to the Lincoln myth and remain enthralled to the central warfare state, no matter the cost. As an example, consider the Scottish referendum that took place back in September. It's something I watched avidly, enjoyed it. And I got two separate arguments from conservatives and even some libertarians. Some conservatives said, well, gee whiz, Jeff, you've got one state right now in Westminster controlling the UK, and then you're going to have two states. So libertarians ought not to be out there promoting more states on the world map. But reducing the size and scope of any single state's dominion is healthy for liberty because it leads us closer to the ultimate goal of self-determination at the individual level, granting each of us sovereignty over our lives. And again, quoting Mises from Liberalism, if it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination to every individual person, it would have to be done. The other argument I heard from conservatives is that, well, gee whiz, what if a secession movement results in a more liberal government in the new territory and the people there actually end up with less freedom? That's not very libertarian. And of course, this was actually possibly the case in Scotland. The younger people who voted overwhelmingly for the secession referendum consider the London government and Westminster far too conservative. They were much more to the left. Their vision is for a Scotland that is a Scandinavian-type social welfare state. They hated being yoked to London, and they wanted to be yoked to Brussels. So had that secession referendum passed in Scotland, the Scots might very well have ended up with less freedom within the confines of Scotland. But I would ask everyone in this room to say, if those 11 aforementioned counties in San Francisco were to break away from the rest of California or to break away from the rest of the United States, wouldn't the rest of California be better off without those 11 San Francisco Bay Area counties? So what neither progressives nor conservatives understand, or worse, maybe they do understand, is that secession provides a mechanism for real diversity. A world where we are not all yoked together, provides a way for people with widely divergent views and interests to live peaceably as neighbors instead of suffering under one commanding central government that pits them against each other.